I spent years bending over backwards for my mother, desperate for even a scrap of approval. But at her birthday dinner, in front of everyone, she lifted her glass and said the one thing I never expected: "My life would be better if you were gone." So I granted her wish by walking away for good. My name is Clara Bennett, and I was 32 years old when I realized my reflection had become a stranger. That night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I studied the woman staring back at me. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Her smile rehearsed like an actress forcing a role she never auditioned for. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, washing my face in a pale glow that made me look even more worn out than I already felt. The house around me was silent. Too silent. No laughter. No comfort. Just the steady ticking of the clock on the dresser behind me. Each second seemed louder than the last, as if time itself was mocking me for standing there, still hoping. "It's still pretending," I whispered to the glass. "I've given everything. My time. My energy. My dreams. All for family." The words fogged the mirror for a moment before fading. Just like every trace of myself had been fading for years. I used to believe that sacrifice was love. That if I bent myself far enough, if I kept giving and giving, eventually someone would see my worth. But here I was, a grown woman with nothing left to give. And still the emptiness stretched wider inside me. A question formed, sharp and heavy, pressing against my chest. What happens when the very person you gave it all for decides that the greatest gift you could offer them is to vanish from their life? I stared at the reflection one last time. The woman in the mirror didn't look defeated. She looked suspended, caught in the moment right before a storm. And deep inside, I felt it, the storm was coming. Every morning in that house began the same way. The air was heavy with the faint smell of antiseptic, and the silence was broken only by the creak of the floorboards under my tired feet. I would balance a tray of pills, a glass of water, and a lukewarm cup of tea as I climbed the stairs to my mother's bedroom. Evelyn Bennett. My mother never once looked grateful. Her eyes would scan me the way a critic studies a painting, searching for every flaw before dismissing it altogether. "Too late," she would mutter if I was a minute off schedule. "Too cold." If the tea wasn't steaming, no matter what I did, there was always something wrong. And yet, I kept showing up. I kept carrying those trays, scrubbing those floors, folding her sheets until my fingers were raw. I told myself this was love. That devotion meant obedience. That someday, if I gave enough, she would finally see me. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was not love. This was a prison built long before I was old enough to recognize it. I remember being 7 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway with my homework clutched in trembling hands. I had worked so hard on it, proud of the neat handwriting and the gold star my teacher had given me. I wanted so badly to hear my mother say, "Good job." Instead, Evelyn glanced at the paper and scoffed. "Your sister was smarter at your age. Look at you, messy hair. Slouching shoulders. No wonder you'll never be more than average." Code. I froze, the paper shaking in my hands. Behind her, my father sat quietly at the table, his eyes on the floor, his cigarette burning down to ash. Thomas Bennett was a gentle man, but his silence was the kind that gave Evelyn the stage. He never raised his voice. He never raised a hand. He simply let her words fall like stones. And they landed on me, one after another. That was my childhood. A chorus of criticism. A father too quiet to intervene. And me always trying. Always failing. Always hoping that tomorrow might finally be the day she saw me as enough. The night of my mother's birthday party lingered in my chest like a wound that refused to close. Her words, "The best gift you could ever give me is to disappear from my life," echoed so loudly that silence became unbearable. For days afterward, I moved through the house like a ghost, the humiliation replaying in my mind every time I heard the clink of a glass or smelled the perfume she wore that night. But then something shifted. My tears dried up. There were no sobs, no breakdowns, just a strange stillness. It was as if grief had burned itself out, leaving only clarity behind. I sat at the kitchen table one morning, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, and realized I had a choice: stay and keep dying in pieces, or leave and finally breathe. That afternoon, I pulled out a suitcase. The sound of the zipper sliding open was louder than any scream I could have made. I filled it not with clothes but with determination. One drawer after another, I emptied my life into boxes, sorting, folding, deciding what deserved to come with me and what deserved to stay buried in that house. I gathered the family photographs stacked in the hallway cabinet. Some I ripped into shreds, watching Evelyn's smile tear in half. Others, like the one where my father held me as a baby, I kept tucked safely in a small envelope. Not everything deserved destruction. Some memories were worth saving. The house seemed to fight back as I worked. Floorboards groaned, lights flickered, and every corner whispered history. But I didn't stop. I called a realtor. I listed the property and moved money out of the shared account into one with only my name on it. Each step was deliberate, almost ceremonial, like breaking a curse. For the first time in my life, I wasn't crying as I acted. My eyes were dry, my hands steady. It wasn't despair that drove me, it was resolve. I told myself, as I sealed the last box, I'm not running away. I'm breaking free. It was no admit. And for the first time, I believed it. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, the same bed I had slept in since high school, and feeling nothing. Not sadness, not fear, just a hollow sort of quiet. The kind that comes after a storm has flattened everything in its path. My eyes were dry, my chest steady. I had spent too many years bleeding out tears in that house. And suddenly, I had none left to give. The decision came to me as naturally as breathing. I couldn't stay. If I did, I would wither until there was nothing left of me but a shell designed to serve her. That thought terrified me more than the unknown. So I stood, pulled open the closet doors, and began the process of unmaking a life. At first, my hands shook as I folded clothes, sorted stacks of papers, opened old drawers that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. But as the hours passed, something shifted. My movements grew deliberate, almost mechanical. I threw away dresses Evelyn had bought for me, each one chosen not to make me feel beautiful, but to make me appear obedient. I bagged up jewelry she had given me on holidays, not as gifts, but as chains disguised in gold. I found a shoebox filled with childhood photographs, me in pigtails, smiling awkwardly at a school play, clutching a spelling certificate. Evelyn had written in red ink on the back of one. Could do better. I tore it in half, the sound sharp and final, like a door slamming shut. Still, I spared a few photos. My father's gentle smile in the corner of one picture was worth keeping. A reminder that not everything in my past was poisoned. When the shredding was done, I opened my laptop and logged into the joint account. My heart pounded as I transferred the balance into a new account under my name. My name. For once, I wasn't afraid of the consequences. I wasn't afraid of her fury. Every keystroke was an act of rebellion, an act of survival. By the end of the week, the house was no longer mine in spirit. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway, marked with words like books, kitchen, keep. I had called a realtor, signed the papers, and put the house on the market. Each signature felt like cutting another rope, loosening the knot that had held me prisoner for so long. I remember standing in the living room on the last night, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and fading perfume. The walls echoed with memories, her voice scolding, my silence caving in. But I didn't cry. I traced my hand along the banister one final time and whispered to the empty space, I'm not running away. I'm breaking free. It's not come. And in that moment, I knew it was true. The chains were falling, one by one. The day I drove out of the city, I didn't look back. My old life shrank in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a smear of gray against the horizon. I kept my eyes on the open road. On the possibility of someplace new. Someplace untouched by her voice. Hours later, the scent of salt hit me before I even saw the water. That first breath of ocean air filled my lungs in a way I hadn't known I was starving for. The town was called Seabrook Haven. A quiet place where fishing boats lined the docks, and gulls cried overhead. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't polished. But it felt real. I parked on a narrow street shaded by sycamores and walked into a small rental office. The manager, a kind man with sun-spotted hands. It showed me a modest apartment with peeling paint and a window that looked out toward the sea. It wasn't much. But when I stepped inside, I felt something loosen in me. The silence here wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I signed the lease as Grace Miller. The name tasted unfamiliar on my tongue, but it carried no chains. For the first time in my life, I could choose who I was without her approval or disapproval. Grace. A word that meant both mercy and strength. Miller. Plain. Ordinary. Safe. Together they formed a shield. A new skin I could inhabit. The apartment came empty. So I furnished it piece by piece. Carefully. Like planting seeds in a garden. A second-hand couch with soft fabric. A wooden table that carried scratches from someone else's life. A lamp that glowed warm against the pale walls. Nothing extravagant. Nothing meant to impress anyone. Each item was mine. Chosen because it comforted me. But it was the mornings that truly transformed me. I would wake before dawn. Make a cup of coffee. And sit by the window as the first light broke across the water. The horizon would blush pink. Then gold. As if the world itself was reminding me that endings and beginnings are just different shades of the same sky. I listened to the waves rolling in. Steady and patient. Teaching me a rhythm that had nothing to do with Evelyn's demands. I started walking the shoreline. Letting the tide soak the hem of my jeans. Letting the wind tangle my hair. With every step, I shed another fragment of the old Clara, the girl who apologized for breathing too loudly. The woman who bent herself into silence just to keep the peace. Here. With the sand beneath my feet, and the gulls circling above. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't running. This isn't exile, I told myself one morning, watching the sun climb higher. This is rebirth. And in Wistain the Spartan, if used happen was all the Spart. And for the first time in years, I believed it. Peace in Seabrook didn't last long. Evelyn had always thrived on control. And my absence gave her the perfect stage to play the victim. Within weeks, articles began to appear in small local papers. Stories about a selfish daughter abandoning her aging mother. The words, ungrateful and heartless, were repeated like mantras. And though the bylines bore different names, I could see my mother's fingerprints all over them. She had hired people to tell her version of the story, painting herself as a fragile woman, betrayed by her own blood. Then came Marianne. My sister called me one evening. Her voice sharp as glass. How could you do this to her? She says you left her with nothing. Do you know what people are saying about us? The sting of her words cut deep. But I didn't raise my voice. I let her anger wash over me. Because I knew it wasn't really hers. It was borrowed. Handed down by our mother. Evelyn had always been skilled at weaving her venom into Marianne's loyalty. Still, I wasn't defenseless anymore. My attorney sent documents proving that I had left Evelyn with more than enough financial security. It wasn't about money, it had never been, but I needed the lies exposed. Piece by piece. The facade began to crumble. When Marianne agreed to meet me in person, I felt the tremor of hope mixed with dread. We sat in a small cafe. The kind of place where no one cared about our family name. For a long time. She stared at me as if searching for the sister she remembered. Her eyes were swollen, as though she had been crying for days. You've changed, she whispered finally. I had to, I answered. The moment hung heavy between us. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay the sapphire earrings. Deep blue, like the ocean outside my window in Seabrook. I pushed them gently across the table toward her. These were Dad's gift to you. He wanted you to have them when you turned 18. But Mom kept them and told you they were lost. She lied. Marianne. She lied to both of us. But especially to you. It's his actor's knitted knot. Marianne's lips trembled as she lifted the earrings, staring at them as if they were relics from another lifetime. Her hands shook. She told me you stole them years ago. It's his actor's knitted my spate. I shook my head. No. She took them to keep us divided, to make sure you never trusted me. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And then suddenly she was out of her chair, pulling me into her arms. The embrace was desperate. Full of years we had lost to manipulation and silence. For the first time since we were children, I felt my sister's loyalty untainted by Evelyn's shadow. In that moment, the truth didn't free our mother, but it freed us. And that was enough. After years of walking on eggshells, life in Seabrook began to unfold with a softness I had almost forgotten existed. The mornings were no longer filled with tension or the sharp edge of someone else's moods. Instead, I woke to the sound of gulls outside my window and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. I found work at a small bookshop tucked between a cafe and an antique store. It smelled of paper and ink, with shelves that leaned slightly under the weight of old hardcovers. The owner, Mrs. Turner, was a widow in her 60s with kind eyes and a sharp wit. She welcomed me as if I had been part of her life forever, giving me the freedom to arrange displays and recommend novels to customers who wandered in on lazy afternoons. There was something healing in the ordinary rhythm of that place. Dusting shelves, ringing up purchases, chatting about literature. It was a kind of therapy no doctor could prescribe. For the first time in years, I caught myself laughing at something simple, like a customer mispronouncing an author's name or Mrs. Turner teasing me about my habit of writing notes in the margins of books. At night, I would walk down to the beach barefoot, letting the sand cool beneath my toes. I carried a small leather journal where I wrote everything I had never dared to say out loud. The sea seemed to listen without judgment, pulling my secrets into its vastness and sending me back fragments of peace in return. Neighbors began to recognize me, waving as I carried groceries or stopped to admire flowers in front yards. An older couple invited me to join them for coffee one morning, and I surprised myself by accepting. We sat on their porch overlooking the ocean, sipping strong coffee while their dog curled at my feet. It was nothing extraordinary. But in that moment I felt seen not as Evelyn's daughter or as someone defined by family scandal, but as Grace Miller, a woman quietly stitching her life back together. One evening, while closing the shop, Mrs. Turner handed me a worn paperback with a smile. "You look like you need this," she said. It was a collection of poems about resilience and rebirth. I stayed up late reading, tears slipping down my cheeks not from sadness, but from the startling recognition that I was beginning to heal. The first real smile came unexpectedly. I caught my reflection in the shop window, hair tousled by the sea breeze, arms full of books, and I realized I looked happy, tentatively at first, but undeniably, it wasn't a mask or a performance. It was me, free of the weight that had defined me for so long. I whispered to myself as the tide rolled in later that night. I'm alive, truly alive. And for the first time in decades, I believed it. It was a Saturday morning when I first saw Marianne step off the bus in Seabrook. For a moment I worried she might change her mind, that she would turn around and vanish into the city, leaving our fragile reconciliation hanging in the air. But she didn't. She spotted me instantly and, without hesitation, walked into my arms. It was the kind of embrace we had been denied for too many years, tight, trembling, layered with both apology and relief. She had never visited this little coastal town before, so I took her straight to the market. We wandered between stalls of fresh fish, homemade bread, and flowers that smelled of salt and sunlight. Marianne's eyes lit up at the simple pleasures, the kind she had never slowed down to notice in her life back home. We bought tomatoes and herbs for dinner, and she insisted on carrying the basket like we were children again, racing each other down the aisles. Back at my apartment, we cooked side by side. The kitchen was too small for two grown women, but somehow that made it better. We bumped elbows. I laughed when the sauce spilled over, and argued about whether garlic should be added before or after the onions. By the time we sat down to eat, the room smelled of warmth and belonging. Over wine, Marianne leaned back in her chair, studying me. "You seem different," she said softly. "Lighter. Head is mutly any tack." I smiled at her. Maybe I finally put down what was never mine to carry. Head is mustard bangly. That night we stayed up late, paging through an old album I had brought with me. Childhood photos of birthdays, summer picnics, and the two of us grinning with gap-toothed smiles. At one point, Marianne pressed her forehead against mine and whispered, "I missed so much of you," and I let her come between us. And as no catted, I held her hand. We were both surviving. Now, maybe, we can live. And as no kazari. The following day we explored the town. Marianne insisted on buying matching scarves from a local shop. Laughing that we looked like tourists, we ate ice cream by the boardwalk, and she teased me about the streak of chocolate I didn't notice on my chin. There was a lightness between us I had thought impossible. Each shared joke, each small kindness, was stitching together the years we had lost. When she finally packed her bag to leave, I felt a pang I hadn't expected. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel abandoned. Instead, I felt anchored. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'll be back soon. This feels like home." And it was ink and soda than even self in the matement. As I watched her bus pull away, I realized something profound. For so long, I had believed family meant chains, obligations, and fear. But sitting in the quiet of my little apartment, surrounded by the remnants of our laughter, I finally understood what family could be. For the first time, I felt I truly had one. Not long after Marianne's visit, word reached me about my mother, Evelyn. The woman who once filled rooms with her sharp voice and relentless commands was now living in silence. The mansion that used to pulse with parties and servants had emptied out, leaving only the echo of her footsteps against marble floors. I didn't see it firsthand at first, but stories trickled back. She would set her dining table for 4, out of habit more than hope, and sit alone in the cavernous room. The clink of her fork against the china reverberated louder than any laughter had ever done. Plates of food, barely touched, were cleared away into the trash. There was no one left to impress, no one left to control. I used to imagine justice as a grand event, some courtroom victory, a headline, a public apology. But in truth, justice looked quieter, more haunting. It was a woman who had pushed everyone away, now surrounded by the very emptiness she had created. Evelyn eventually began therapy. At least that's what Marianne told me after hearing it from an old acquaintance. I don't know what she confessed in those sessions. If she ever spoke my name or acknowledged the harm she caused, maybe she tried to justify it. Or maybe she sat in silence, confronted by memories that refused to soften. What mattered to me was not whether she found peace. What mattered was knowing her grip on my life was broken. There were nights when I would walk along the shoreline, the ocean stretching endlessly before me, and I would think of her sitting in that darkened house. I felt the salt air against my skin, the sand shifting beneath my feet, the sky opening in colors of gold and lavender. She, meanwhile, lived with closed curtains and the weight of her own shadows. I did not forgive her. I will not pretend that some magical reconciliation made sense of the years of cruelty. Forgiveness, I realized, is not a requirement for freedom. Sometimes, simply stepping away, choosing life instead of pain, is enough. The contrast became a kind of poetry in my mind. Her walls, tall and cold, kept her prisoner. My open horizon set me free. Her silence was heavy, suffocating. My laughter, shared with new friends, and with Marianne, was light, expansive. She was left with memories twisted by control. I carried forward with stories built on love. One evening, writing in my journal by the window, I caught myself smiling without effort. That smile had nothing to do with victory over her. It had everything to do with reclaiming my own soul. For the first time, I was no longer defined by being Evelyn's daughter. I was simply Clara. And that, I thought, was justice enough. I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I could picture it as clearly as if I had been standing there. Evelyn walked through the mansion she once ruled like a queen, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. Every step echoed down the long hallway, bouncing off walls that used to carry the chatter of guests and the sound of music during her grand parties. Now the silence swallowed her whole. She slowed in front of a gallery of family portraits. I know she kept them there as trophies. Frozen moments where she could point and say, "See, I built this. This is mine." But when she stopped in front of one particular frame, a picture of me as a little girl, Marianne beside me, my father still alive and smiling, something shifted. Her hand trembled as she lifted it from the hook. The glass slipped before she even realized her grip had weakened. It crashed to the floor, the sound ringing through the empty corridor like a gunshot. Shards scattered across the polished floor. Evelyn stared at them, her reflection fractured into a dozen broken pieces. For the first time, maybe ever, she realized there was no one left to clean it up. No maid to rush over. No daughter to kneel beside her. No husband to gently take the frame from her hands. Just her and the shards of a family she had splintered long before that picture ever hit the ground. I imagine she must have bent down, fingers hovering over the glass, debating whether to pick it up or leave it there. And maybe she whispered my name, or Marianne's, to the empty air, waiting for a response that would never come. The mansion had always been her fortress. She built it bigger than she needed, filled it with chandeliers and mirrors, rooms no one ever truly lived in. It was designed to impress, to intimidate. But grandeur without love is nothing more than a hollow shell. And now, walking those same hallways, she could not escape the truth. She was the last one left inside. Sometimes at night, neighbors said, 2 lights flickered on in just one room, the study where she would sit for hours. She would pour herself a glass of wine, to set it on the desk, and stare at the shelves lined with books she never read. In front of her, a fire burned low, the crackle of wood the only sound in the entire house. She must have felt the emptiness pressing against her like a weight, the silence louder than any scolding voice she had once used to keep us in line. I don't believe Evelyn cried often. She was too proud for tears, too convinced that emotion was weakness. But alone, stripped of an audience, I think she allowed herself to weep. Perhaps it was grief for what she had lost. Or perhaps it was anger that the world no longer bent to her control. Either way, the sound of her sobs would vanish into the cavernous rooms, unanswered. I sometimes wondered, late at night, while journaling by the window, if she ever regretted it all. Did she replay conversations? The times she belittled me, the times she dismissed Marianne, the years she treated love as a transaction instead of a gift? Or did she still believe she had been right all along, punishing us in her own twisted vision of protection? Either way, the truth stood in the silence of that house. Evelyn had no one left. The photo frame was broken. And unlike before, no one was coming to piece it back together. I never sat in that office with her, but I can imagine it as if I had. Evelyn, my mother, perched on the edge of a leather chair in a therapist's office that smelled faintly of lavender and books. She hated being there. I know, because she had always said therapy was for the weak, for people who couldn't control themselves. Yet there she was, a woman who had once controlled everything, now clutching the arms of her chair like she was bracing for impact. The therapist was a calm man. Middle-aged. The kind who probably had heard every story of broken families, controlling parents, and estranged children. He didn't rush her. He simply sat across from her with a notebook balanced on his knee, waiting for her to speak. And when she finally did, her voice cracked under the weight of words she'd never allowed herself to say. "I just want my daughters back," she whispered. "I just want my family again." It is very was outdated fairy tale. Maybe the room was silent for a long moment after that. The kind of silence where truth hangs in the air like smoke. Then the therapist leaned forward. His tone steady but firm. "Wanting them back isn't enough. You can't pull people into your orbit by force. Perhaps before you ask for them, you have to learn how to love them. Not by control. Not by fear, but by letting them be themselves." Afters is the capic. I can almost see her flinch at that. Love. Not control. For Evelyn, control had always been her definition of love. She believed if she kept us close, managed our choices, dictated our lives, she was protecting us. Letting go had never been part of her vocabulary. I imagine she tried to argue. She probably said, "I gave them everything. I made sure they never lacked anything." Because that was her favorite defense, equating material comfort with affection. But the therapist didn't back down. "You gave them safety." Yes. But safety without freedom is just another kind of prison. Children don't remember the size of the house. They remember if they felt seen. Did they feel heard? Did they feel accepted as who they were? Her face must have tightened. The woman who never tolerated criticism suddenly had to sit and listen to a stranger tell her she'd failed at the very role she valued most, being a mother. It's strange. Picturing her in that vulnerable moment, part of me wants to say she deserved it, that it was about time someone told her the truth to her face. But another part of me, the part that still aches when I remember, the rare times she brushed my hair or held my hand when I was small, feels a sliver of sorrow. Because I know how much she believed in her own version of love. And now, in that office, the truth must have hit her like a cold wave. She hadn't loved us in the way we needed. I don't know how many sessions she attended, maybe only a few. Maybe more than she expected. But each time she walked out of that building, she returned to the empty house, where the echoes of her life followed her. She had money, reputation, and a mansion filled with artifacts of her triumphs. But none of it could warm the silence that trailed her through every hallway. The therapist's words stayed with her. Though, she couldn't fix the past. And she couldn't force us to return. All she could do was face herself in the mirror, the one person she'd avoided all her life. And that, I think, was the hardest therapy of all. The air smelled of salt and freedom. I sat on the sand with my knees pulled to my chest, watching the tide roll in and out like it had done for centuries. Long before my mother. Long before me. The ocean didn't care about control. About power. About old family grudges. It just moved. Steady and endless. Reminding me that life could flow without chains. The wind tangled my hair and stung my cheeks. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, I welcomed it. It was proof that I was alive. That I was here on my own terms. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking under someone's voice, someone's rules, someone's disapproving stare. I could breathe. Really breathe. I remembered the last words my mother ever said to me before I left that house. Disappear. At the time, it cut me open. I thought it meant I wasn't worth being seen. That I wasn't worth being loved. But sitting here now, with the sun sinking low on the horizon, I finally understood. She told me to vanish from her world. And I did. But in doing so, I found a new one. My own. When my mother told me to disappear, I did. I whispered to the sea as if confessing to an old friend. But disappearing from her world was exactly how I discovered myself. The sky was a masterpiece of orange, pink, and violet. Waves caught the dying light and scattered it back, glittering like they were applauding my survival. I felt a smile creep onto my face, Not the forced smile I used to wear at family dinners or school functions, but one that rose quietly, naturally, like a seed finally breaking through the soil. There was no bitterness left. Not anymore. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to prove my worth to anyone. My freedom was proof enough. The life ahead of me wasn't defined by my mother's mistakes, her shadows, or her control. It was defined by choice mine. I leaned back on my hands and let the grains of sand sift between my fingers. Each tiny piece had been broken, weathered, and reshaped by the ocean. Yet here it was, forming something soft and whole again. Maybe that's what healing looked like. The tide crept closer, kissing my toes with cool water, pulling back again like a gentle promise. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of it steady me. For once, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval or fearing anyone's wrath. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was peace. As the sun dipped fully into the horizon, I let out a long breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding for years. I wasn't my mother's shadow. I wasn't the child locked in her control. I was simply Clara. And that was enough. And in that quiet, with the last streak of gold fading from the sky, I knew this was the real beginning.